Ah, Sweden, this lovely nation I'm residing in, just made global news because of these mass-coordinated car fires taking place in 6 different major cities, all at the same time, with probably over 100 cars being destroyed in total. And what's truly remarkable here is that one of the perpetrators was already convicted and awaiting prison time for other crimes, such as robbery, driving drunk, and owning an illegal weapon. Because in Sweden, you get convicted first, then you can just roam around freely for weeks, sometimes even months, until it's time for your prison appointment. See how too much bureaucracy can be a bad thing? To tell you the truth though, I'm kind of annoyed by how this is even a big deal. I mean, this has been going on for the past decade, and there's no exaggeration. It's been going on for a very long time, getting worse and worse for every year. So it's like, why did people choose now to react? I understand the election is coming up, but it's still annoying to see some people act so surprised, because this is just, you know, a common thing if you're living in Sweden and you actually read up on things. The only thing that's changed here is that someone recorded it so people can see how coordinated it is and how calm they are while doing it. What else? Of course they're not afraid. Why would they be? Of course they're not sneaking around with it. Why would they be? Nothing is gonna happen to them. I mean, Jesus Christ, remember the guy I mentioned in the start of the video? He got 10 months in prison for robbery, driving drunk, and owning an illegal weapon. Setting a few cars on fire will probably give him less than that. And something which isn't often emphasized here is that immigrants are the biggest victims when it comes to this type of shit. Which is why the leftist narrative is so provocative. I mean, do you understand that what's happened here is that immigrant working class got their cars set on fire by thugs so that they can't get to work or drive their children to school. And I feel really bad for those people, because nobody gives a shit about them. They're not getting represented anywhere. The media isn't giving the most attention to pissed off locals who fell victim to this shit. If anything, the leftist narrative here is that the perpetrators are actually the victims, because systemic racism. So it's really no wonder that the Sweden Democrats are the 3rd biggest party amongst immigrants as well, because the left decided to side with the people who are attacking the working class. And I'm not even gonna waste your time by reading what Swedish politicians have to say, because they're literally condemning the result of their own multicultural policies and acting like they didn't have any hand in creating this situation. The Moderate Party, Sweden's biggest right-wing band of conservatives, even went so far as to pay for Google ads so that anyone searching for car fires in Sweden is directed to their website. Talk about disaster capitalism. This really reinforces the idea that politicians benefit from the existence of social issues, because without any problems, there wouldn't be a market for politicians. Their excuse here is that they simply want to inform the public on their policies in this area, which is really appropriate given that the mass immigration and cultural relativism that they've been enforcing for the past decade is why we're seeing all these integration issues to begin with. Honestly, if we just legalized cannabis, this type of gang crime activity wouldn't be nearly as prevalent. All those shootings and grenade attacks you've been hearing about taking place in Sweden are the result of drug wars. These gangs are fighting over cannabis. It's a 3.5 billion crown market, and there's 14-year-olds in Sweden making 10 grand a day selling weed so that white inner city kids can get high. Is that reasonable? Just make cannabis legal and you've killed off a good chunk of this gang activity. It's worked really well in border states close to the cartels. Because of course, taking away the financial funding for criminal gangs is gonna make those gangs less powerful and thus less active. There's been a few funny reactions though that I really think we should take a look at. Here's a leading center party politician who claims that these car fires were the result of either Nazis, nationalists, or Russia. Because there's no way immigrants could do this stuff. And it's kinda awkward when this post gets a like, both from this leftist politician as well as this right-wing politician who used to be our Minister of Justice. What does that say about our politicians? Of course, this is not the only example. A prominent Swedish feminist rapper claimed that right-wing extremists were behind these car fires, as did a top politician from the left party. Yeah, they're actually blaming this on Nazis. This really shows what a mental illness political correctness is. is. It's like the Special Olympics of rationalization. Blaming Swedish nationalists for what immigrants are doing to their own neighborhoods. As I mentioned earlier, these car fires have been a thing for decades. Are you saying that all of them were arranged by Russia? And yet Alex Jones is the one being deplatformed by Twitter and YouTube? Are you shitting me? It's funny how their line of reasoning is, this couldn't have been immigrants because it's too organized. Well, talk about the racism of low expectations. Are you saying that immigrants are too dumb to organize anything? Well, gee golly gosh, I think you're starting to sound like Hitler. No, but see, that's the thing with this kind of destructive immigrant stereotype. Their entire existence is a walking election campaign for the Nationalist Party. People aren't becoming racist because of propaganda. They're turning to the Sweden Democrats because they're actually forced to interact with people like this in their day-to-day life and be called Swede cunts by them. But of course, if you're a gluten-free, wholesome leftist living in an all-white neighborhood and truly believing in solidarity, how would you know any of this? I mean, you've never actually been forced to live in the result of the multiculturalist dream that you hold so dear. And of course, the perpetrators are immigrants with prior convictions, meaning they're probably gang criminals or trying to be. One of them was even arrested in Turkey by their border police and is now being extradited to Sweden, where he will likely receive a punishment so flaccid it will make Jeb Bush look like a porn star. The prosecutor in the case dismissed all of these left-wing conspiracy theories and said that one of the working hypotheses is that this was a reaction to the community work that's been happening in the area. And by this, I think he's referring to police efforts to decrease crime. Which makes sense, since this is also why immigrant gangs throw rocks at police and fire trucks that drive into their neighborhood. It's to demonstrate their power over the neighborhood. Normal people don't really understand what's happening here because they don't have the criminal mentality, but it's also a cultural phenomenon. These gangs perceive the police as enemies towards their territory. In their eyes, the police have no reason being there because it's an immigrant neighborhood where different laws apply. What Sweden is looking at here is a new kind of criminal. In Northeast Gothenburg, basically all organized crime can be tracked back to one big immigrant family, where 100 individuals are involved in anything from murder and extortion to abuse of women and drug trade. According to one police chief, this network is an issue of honor culture and clan mentality, which brings to mind an article I read by a Swedish prosecutor who says that today's gangs are noticeably different from what we used to have. Quote, "The gang criminals we see today are not young men growing up without opportunities in life or suffering addiction issues. Instead, they simply don't share our norms. There's not even the desire to be loyal with Swedish society. And prison time isn't shameful to them. It's merely inconvenient." And their loyalty towards the clan and its territory is incredibly strong, which goes both ways. We can't expect help from their families when we want to break them out of this criminal lifestyle, because oftentimes the families are a part of it, and like the fact that their son is bringing home money. End of quote. He also describes how usually the way a society deals with crime is by viewing the person as one of us, someone who shares our cultural norms, but for various reasons such as unemployment, addiction, or shitty social circumstances with family issues and such, falls into a criminal lifestyle. And so you combat this problem with things like surveillance, therapy, education, punishment, and involving their families. But this implies that the criminal shares society's fundamental values. This is not the case with immigrant gangs, and so the authorities don't know how to deal with the issue. Another big difference from before is how easily offended they are. They've been raised to believe in honor and immediate satisfaction of needs. A sentiment which is echoed in this article from a Swedish science paper. It mentions how most of the gangs in Malmö, for example, are from Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Albania, or Serbia. Usually they're family related, and I quote, "They are permeated by traditional norms, meaning that perceived injustices must be corrected so that the group can maintain their honor. The consequence of this is that trivial events can trigger severe spirals of violence." One example of this is when a criminal parked his car outside of a store, at which point the owner told him that he had to move it. This made him feel like his honor had been violated, so he felt the need to forcibly collect a fine of several 100,000 crowns. A researcher at Sweden's Crime Council describes the phenomenon as following. These criminals don't have cops or courts they can turn to, and in the law of the jungle, a monopoly on violence becomes extremely important. Therefore, conflicts constantly arise around some girl, money, shit-talking, whatever. End of quote. Which brings to mind this opinion piece by an immigrant living in the ghetto, who hangs out with the type of people who set cars on fire. He argued that the reason they vandalize like this is because of racism, and in order to give examples of this racism, he talks about how the police harass immigrants by randomly frisking them in public, which is embarrassing to their loved ones. However, the police usually responds to claims like this by saying that it's simply what needs to be done in order to combat organized crime, since many of the people that they frisk usually hang out with criminals, or at least look like they do. Do we really want a society where the police don't act on suspicion? The writer also claims that other neighborhoods create nice activities for their locals, such as social events where they hand out hamburgers, or simply rec centers where older people can meet the younger generation. But then again, rec centers have been described as recruitment centers for gang criminals and Muslim radicals, so it's hard to take his word on this. It's not sure it would make anything better. He also complains about the lack of maintenance in the area, how football fields, for example, don't even have goal nets. But once again, I'm not sure it's that simple. In other cases, car fires can also be a matter of insurance fraud. One former criminal talked about how he would make $500 setting a car on fire because the owner wanted to cash in. Other immigrants mentioned to a journalist how they set cars on fire and record it, then make $400 selling it to the mainstream media, which clearly becomes an incentive considering that the perpetrators are often low income, unemployed, and don't have high consuming power, meaning that they rarely travel outside of their own neighborhood since they can't afford to. Which explains why they set other immigrant cars on fire, since it's simply what's close by. But one police chief also claimed that car fires is a kind of popularity contest. Different neighborhood gangs or cities compete over who can be the worst, so it's really about attention. They noticed this in France as well, where authorities refrained from reporting on the number of torched cars after it was discovered that a district-by-district breakdown fueled destructive competition between rival gangs. One Swedish academic confirmed this theory, saying that when cars start burning, police and fire trucks arrive, and the media blows up big headlines. 99% of people find it horrifying, but 1% think it's cool and like the attention. He did a study in English called Urban Unrest in Sweden, which I'll link to in the video description for those who want to read it. But his conclusion is that car fires aren't so much cultural as it is about exclusion and poverty. In 2016, a former criminal was interviewed who used to torch cars himself, and says that many times it's younger people trying to show off to older criminals, the cool guys of the neighborhood, so to speak. And sometimes it could also be an expression of individual conflict, meaning two guys had an altercation and set fire to each other's cars. But according to this ex-con, it can be enough that a guy thinks a person looked at him the wrong way, so he'll set his car on fire for that alone. But not everyone likes this, because it attracts police attention and disrupts business. The ex-con says he misses the time when there were local neighborhood cops with regular presence, who had a good contact with the locals. According to him, nowadays police just immediately jump in with brutality against anyone, regardless what they've done, and sometimes pick people up only to drop them off in rival gang territory. What's clear, however, is that all of the criminals interviewed in this article clarified that it's not a political protest. Burning cars is mostly just their idea of fun. But it can also be an issue of driving away attention from other crimes currently taking place, so that the police are preoccupied. There are numerous different motivations to why this kind of stuff happens, but I've yet to see political action that really matters. What's interesting though is that car fires is not nearly the same issue in Finland and Norway, which you can see on this graph here. So whatever these two countries are doing, Sweden can probably learn from them. There's no real reason to be afraid if you're a criminal in Sweden, and sadly, you can thank the left for that. When you have a Marxist ideology that views crime as a symptom rather than bad behavior that needs to be corrected, then you're not gonna view criminals as criminals. You're gonna view them as victims of social injustice, which will only fuel their criminal lifestyle even more. Do remember that criminals have a different life philosophy than ordinary people. Their mentality is quite complex in how it's made up of all kinds of different rationalizations as to why it's always someone else's fault, and their actions are always the result of someone else just being provocative or irresponsible. For example, I've seen interviews with criminals where they actually say stuff like, oh well, it's your own fault that you got stabbed. You should have just handed over your wallet. That would have been a smart thing to do. Why are you trying to be a hero? Or, it's your own fault if you get traumatized when I rob a bank. You're a teller. You knew that this risk existed. Why did you pick this profession? Come on, you only have yourself to blame. So you think of that mindset, and then consider what happens when the public debate feeds your rationalizations. Well, wait a minute, it's not my fault. I grew up in a bad neighborhood. I'm not rich. Yeah, that's right. Fuck the system. The cops are evil and Sweden is racist. They all have this coming. It's not really hard to figure out how it's all connected. And if you seriously believe that unfair financial redistribution and lack of welfare is the core reason to crime, then your solution is gonna be adjusted based upon that. Your solution is gonna be to throw welfare on these people. And if you ever punish them, it's not gonna be punishment enough, because you kinda simultaneously view them as victims. This is a really interesting and important debate article that more people should read. It's a former convict talking about what Swedish prisons are like. He was convicted of aggravated assault connected to his alcoholism, and he basically sums it all up by saying, and I quote, "I appreciate being treated like a person, but I'm a convict and I should serve my sentence, not eat cake in my hotel bed in front of a movie. My thoughts are with all the senior citizens who have it way worse than me. I can't even fathom how bizarre this experience was, and I became more and more angry at how excessively well I'm taken care of when I know how many people are suffering. My grandma's quality of life would increase by 50% if she got to live the life that I lived in jail." End of quote. And that really says a lot about how shitty this country has become. Senior citizens basically have to become criminals when they're old just to be able to lead a decent life. Because working hard your entire life and paying taxes isn't enough. Sweden now has the poorest senior citizens in all of Scandinavia. Is that something to be proud of? And every time I talk about how crime isn't being punished enough in Sweden, I get at least one hipster sociology asshole student saying, actually, research shows that severity of punishment has no effect on deterring crime. Eat a dick. I don't care about your BuzzFeed research. Arabs respect power, not weakness. And clearly, if it's too comfortable to be a criminal in Sweden, well, then you're probably gonna keep at it. Because there's no social incentive not to. Now, I'm all for rehabilitating criminals. I definitely think that's possible. But there's two problems here. In Sweden, it's optional. The criminal chooses if they want treatment and therapy. It's optional, meaning that they choose whether or not they want to just sit their months through and be comfortable, or if they want to have very unpleasant insights that forces them to realize how they've affected other people's lives, thus making them change their behavior. Should it be a surprise to anyone when they don't choose the latter? It's not like therapy is fun. And two, tougher sentences doesn't exclude rehabilitation. You can give justice to victims and fix criminals. In fact, I would argue that a good sign of rehabilitation is when someone realizes that, oh shit, I deserve to sit here for a couple of years because I did a really bad thing. It influenced other people terribly. They're gonna suffer way longer than a couple of years, and I just need to take responsibility. But if the person just feels outraged about the consequences of their actions, well then that's a pretty clear sign that they didn't really learn anything. Then it's pretty obvious that they don't truly acknowledge their errors. You can't improve and change your behavior unless you truly take responsibility first. At least that's what I think. And if it really is the socioeconomic vulnerabilities that cause people to behave like this, then how come the majority of immigrants in the ghettos don't act like this? They're living in the exact same socioeconomical conditions, yet they don't burn cars, they don't rape women, and they don't rob stores. That alone should make it obvious that any left-wing research on crime is deeply subjective and flawed. There is more research to suggest that crime is largely genetic. A study looking at 2 million twins and siblings found that 50% of crime could be explained by hereditary dietary factors. And barely 15% could be attributed to environment. If we really want to understand crime, this is where we need to start. Otherwise, we're just wasting time, which is gonna cause way more crime to pile up because we're not being serious about preventing it. Instead, we're just being socially anxious. We need to change the way we look at crime and try to prevent it before it happens. We need the biological perspective and research as well, not just Marxist sociology. We need to understand that tougher sentencing is as vital as rehabilitation. And we need to differentiate between perpetrator and victim. Otherwise, we'll get a media that encourages this type of behavior and makes them into social justice martyrs. I feel like the solutions here are actually pretty simple. It's just that political correctness is standing in the way.